Right, is this on? Yes, it's on. Okay, I can hear that. If I can manage to not fall down while I'm up here. So I'm going to ask you to take a little bit of a departure with me because the conversations thus far have been around the early stages of the performance management process, integrating performance management, and the lens that I bring to this conversation is the lens of an operator. I'm not going to go into much on us, except to say that our team is made up almost exclusively of former CEOs and a few former CFOs. And the conversations that we have with leaders in organizations tend to be, they're operator conversations, and we find ourselves with a bit of a translation challenge. So we are brought into the organization by HR, really smart people who are HR business partners, heads of executive development, heads of global talent, and they have an agenda around raising the performance of leaders. And then we talk to the operators, and their entire focus is on hitting their numbers or helping their numbers get better faster. And we were having a conversation yesterday with somebody around the question of succession, and I was asking about stakeholders, and the leader said something about whoever in HR owns that. And part of the conversation was a timeout. Did you hear what you just said? Whose team is this? Whose position are we talking about succession for? So who owns that again? So I say that because in that role as translators sometimes, and getting the operators to think differently about talent and to hear what HR is bringing to the table differently, and if they're not already attuned to it, we look for patterns, and we look for what I would say low-hanging fruit for HR to raise profile. And this question of teams has come up. I'll talk about this more in a moment, but this question of teams has come up more in the last 9 months than it has come up in the prior 3 or 4 years combined, and with a level of intensity that I just haven't seen in a while. And the conversation goes something like this. When we bring our management team together, and that could be management of a business unit or a plant or a region, what tends to happen is that the leader interrogates one person about what's happening in, let's say, Asia, then while everybody else checks their email. Then when you finish reporting out, then I come to you and I ask about what's going on in Latin America, and you tell me, and everybody else checks email. And it's that kind of conversation. Now, we're hitting our numbers. We're meeting all of our performance metrics. But when we start talking about how do we truly grow the business, how do we capitalize on risk, there's a bit of a disconnect because, quite frankly, people don't know what the person across the table from them does or how they make money. And so what's intriguing to me for this conversation is that HR tends to have a unique perspective on this. The business, the operators tend to want to go off and have a strategic offsite about strategic planning or execution. And I think the conversation is more complicated than that. So we're going to talk about teams here for a little bit. And if you think about the concept that not only are, actually before I go there even, let's just do this. Think about a team that you know well. So this can either be a team that you are on or a team that you support. The purpose of this conversation today is to help you look for opportunities where you can step in or you can facilitate a conversation to help those teams be better. But before we do that, just think for a moment about how could that, what are some either behaviors or interactions on those teams or performance breakdowns that you see that are of concern to you? Are any just high-level things that come to mind? Think about it and just discuss briefly with the person next to you for just a moment here. What do you see on teams in your organization, teams that you're closely aligned with, that strike you as potential areas of concern or opportunity for improvement? Take a minute, please. Okay. Okay. We'll come back to table talk a couple of times during this presentation, partly because it's after lunch and I want to keep the, the juices flowing. But just if you could, what are some things that came out as from your conversations? Yes.
Teams have conflicting priorities.
Conflicting priorities within the team. Do you mean?
Within the team and with teams that they're part of.
Within the team and with teams that they're part of. Okay. Conflicting priorities. Yes. Accountability. Say more about that.
So give me an example of senior level resources developing an idea, but then having to step away to different initiatives and not being able to drive.
To follow through. Okay. Okay. One or two others? Yes.
There's no shared accountability.
Shared accountability for common goals. Okay. And one more.
Asking for one thing and not behaving the way you're asking.
Okay. Asking for one thing and not behaving the way you're asking. Yeah. Then there's laughter and recognition. I mean, I think that what's interesting about this is that the points you make are absolutely supported in both our research and in the reality of what we're running into every day right now. I'm going to have some data points in a second, and they're all from 2013 specifically, and it's important to me because, as I mentioned, I think this is a real-time challenge. I think these things come in swings, and we're at one end of the pendulum right now. There's been a tremendous amount of time and energy spent on individual performance, including for the highest potentials and for leaders. How well do you perform as a leader, or if you're in a team, how well do you perform as the leader of that team? Which is a different question than how do you perform as a peer on a team. Most of our measurement in most organizations, I'm not saying this is everybody, but for the last number of years have been built around those kinds of metrics. And what that's done is developed very deep expertise within a silo or a vertical. And you've got leaders who are really good at getting things done with a shoestring crew. But again, there's that challenge of I'm not actually sure how you make money even though you're my peer. And so if we look at this, we looked at data from 400 executive teams across numerous industries and countries. I should be clear, part of this is from the Barrett Values Center, who we team with closely. We specifically, Merryck, worked with about 380 of those, not all 400. But I think several things emerged, particularly in the second half of last year. One is that basically 1 in 5 teams has an answer to the question of why they exist as a team. And I will tell you that this was an accidental aha that first came to mind, or first came to my attention in spring of last year, because we were doing some teamwork and doing some due diligence and asking a question that I thought was a gimme. I thought it was the easy point of entry into the conversation about how a leadership team could be more effective, which was, why do you exist as a team? And the awkward silence that would follow that question was intriguing to me. And at first I thought it was one company. There was a large-scale automotive supplier, Japanese owners, Michigan headquarters of about 1,000 people, 60,000 manufacturing workforce in Latin America, European CEO, so you can see there's no cultural dynamics in play at all. But I thought, and they were in trouble. They were hemorrhaging cash. They had manufacturing quality problems. I thought maybe this is a result of that sort of unique set of circumstances. But in fact, as we continued to ask this question, we started asking it around the world, and we were asking it everywhere. We found that there was a bit of at the moment, a bit of a I don't know if crisis is a strong word, but there's certainly a strong pattern. Beyond that, if you ask the question, and one of you mentioned this just now about sort of what you're asking for versus what you're demonstrating, if we started asking questions about, so if you're clear on purpose, what are you clear on the sort of the values that you as a leadership team bring to the table that are going to help you achieve that purpose? And then are you clear about the behaviors that are going to either undermine or drive your ability to achieve that purpose? And as you can see, the numbers got more and more unclear. And I'm going to go back to this notion of organizations being teams of teams. And if you start to scale this across companies, if the top teams aren't particularly clear on purpose, and they're setting a model for behavior that also means that the teams below them aren't necessarily clear for purpose, you run into challenges. And by the way, we would see this in high-performing organizations too. Again, teams where everybody meets their metrics, they all meet their numbers, but nobody's willing to take a particular risk, because if you take a stretch target and you miss your stretch target, then you've missed your target. It's not that you missed your stretch. And so the question there becomes, how do we actually accelerate our performance as a team? The underlying causes were the exact same. What that drove us to start doing, and I want to be clear that I'm not putting this up here as again, I come back to the operator principle. I'm not putting this up here as something that's never been seen before, or something that is a panacea for all ills. I think that there is a challenge right now, and this is a conversation that can be facilitated by anybody to help drive clarity. But because teams are unclear about purpose, values, and behaviors, and because they're most comfortable as operators jumping into strategy and execution, they would tend to do that without having made the full connection. And if you think about, whether it's the book from Cynic, Start With Why, or Lencioni's 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, we didn't start in theory, we started in the mess that we were sort of seeing, but the fundamental questions come along much of this lines. And James March from Stanford wrote a long time ago now, but that it's important when you're thinking about operational excellence to start with the plumbing before you get to the poetry. And strategy and execution in some ways are the poetry. They're the visible parts that people can see, and the pretty parts if they work well. But there's this underlying question about the plumbing that actually makes that work. And when teams aren't clear on those fundamental pieces, it's a challenge. Now, I will also say that again, working with, if a team is extremely dysfunctional, a team of operators, they might come to the HR person and say, okay, we're actively fighting with each other in our meetings. We probably need an offsite about communication, right? It has to be pretty bad because it's not a comfortable conversation for them in many cases. But they will probably never come and say, we should have an offsite around our purpose and our values. So I'm not suggesting you start any conversation there. But I think that if you see these opportunities in your organization, and we'll talk about specific teams in a moment, but if you see these opportunities in your organization, what we find is they do want to go to strategy. I'm not going to dissuade them from the question of strategy. What we will do is say, how clear are you on purpose? Why do you exist? And depending on the quality of that answer, say, let's just take a minute to get clarity on that. Do you mind? And in the minute that you take, you'll unpack whether that's a half-day conversation or a 15-minute conversation. And just one more story about this. We sat down with a CEO in a high-functioning company. They've come through a turnaround. They're doing well. Their next challenge is growth. And asked the CEO before he wanted us to take the C-suite for an offsite, and can we just be clear on what your purpose is? And he said, oh, well, that's simple. We exist to set policy and set strategy and make policy decisions. It was quiet for a moment. We didn't say a word. And he said, that wasn't a very good answer, was it? When you asked his team that question, you got 5 different answers. Not unlike, as I know some of you know, when you ask what does strategy mean, you tend to get that kind of variability. But having that conversation then at the offsite, which took a long time with them, it took half a day. But once they got clarity around that, and we talked about some of the specific behaviors that they were currently doing that would undermine their ability, their ability to achieve that purpose or that function, then strategy and execution became much, much more productive conversations. And it felt practical, and we had never positioned the conversation as, let's get together and talk about purpose as a driver of performance. So I don't mean that to be sneaky, I mean for it to be subtle. Because coming back to this notion of how do you translate your purpose, your ability to add value, and then into their ability to drive the performance of their team to a whole different level, this is a way in the side door that changes the dialogue forever after. So I just want to be clear that context is not the same as purpose. So when you ask the question about why a team exists, you may need to probe a bit. These are 3 sample questions. You can go any other direction with these, but what we find helpful why does your team exist? Why are you uniquely within your organization poised to accomplish? That can be another hard question for people, and you might work your way up from the bottom, which is, how clear is the organization on your roles? You'll often get comments like, well, I think people think we do this. Is that right? Well, it's partially right, but we also, a better answer would be, and you start to move yourself down a path toward a definition. I put these up here because I'm about to throw this back to you, and the question I'm going to ask, I always get some frowns from the audience with this question, because I'm asking you the question I ask the business leaders. Think of a team. So again, I don't care if this is your team or a team that you support, but it needs to be a team you know well enough to answer this question. What is that team's purpose? And if you would take just a minute and maybe jot down a note or two, and then I will have you discuss it at the table, but just take a minute before we start talking and write down some initial thoughts. Also a really unfair question to ask right after lunch. Take a moment, if you would now, and just share that with the person. If you're at a table with many people, you can just discuss it as a table. If you're at a table with 2, I think we've got a couple of tables with it. Then just talk to the person next to you. But talk about, is it clear? Is it partial? Is it a blank piece of paper right now? Just have a conversation quickly about how easy or hard that question is to answer. Are we for time? Time? Oh, okay. Check my timer. Okay. Oh, that was loud. So, just some quick thoughts or insights from around the room. Was it easy? Do you feel? No? Was it easy for anybody?
I think we got there.
Okay.
I think it forced us to ask the question. We got there, but it didn't come off the top of our heads.
Okay.
For me, at least.
Okay, that's fair. Yes.
We have a personal family saying, "Yeah, but."
Yeah, but okay.
And so, yeah, it's simple, but it's more complicated once you take that first step.
Right. Right.
Yeah, because it was a conversation we were having. Not hard for us to come up with the bumper sticker, one sentence description, but what does that actually mean
Yeah.
to different people in that group? I've
Yeah.
got a group, we can do the one sentence, we've got nothing done in 3 meetings, because as soon as you go below that level, it's everybody wandering off in their own direction.
Right. Right. Yes, exactly right. We, it's interesting. I had this conversation last week in Atlanta with a room of about 300. And I asked the easy or hard question. There was one person who raised his hand and said it was easy, and I asked him to say a little more about that. And he's a HR business partner in an industry, in a company in an industry that is in radical decline. But his purpose question, he said it was easy. And I asked him, why? Tell me about why it was easy. And he said, we about 3 years ago changed everything in the organization to be purpose-driven. There is no meeting that starts without a declaration of why are we here, what are we hoping to accomplish, and what do we walk away with. And they're in print distribution. And if you just let that phrase settle in and think about that industry. But he said there are, the delivery guy who's an independent contractor out there dropping off the New York Times on somebody's front step is clear that if he or she can complete their route a little bit faster, it actually ends up making us healthier as an organization because it makes a happier client, a happier customer. They've had they started this 4 years ago. He said they've had the 4 best years of financial performance in the history of their organization. So, it's not all as simple as getting to the bumper sticker, clearly, because then there's that whole pesky thing around execution. But getting clarity up front on this is not as simple as, well, we've got a mission statement on the wall, that's what we do. No. That is not why your team exists. That may be what the company writ large does, but why does your team exist? Let's talk about how that starts to translate into actions and into things. Values is another tricky conversation because every company has values. They're prominently displayed somewhere. Some companies, they're very much a part of the daily conversation. And what you don't want to do with a team is try and reinvent the corporate values. That's not the conversation. The conversation is, how do we 6 people around this table, what are our values in achieving the purpose we need to achieve? And this is an important conversation because, especially the more senior the teams are, the corporate values, which they might be really good at talking about and espousing in speeches, and they might believe in truly, but they don't own them. Chances are good that they, as a leadership team, didn't create those values. Those values predated them and will post-date them. So the question is, I come back to that notion of those 6 or 8 people sitting around the table, what are the values that are actually going to drive their performance as a team, their achievement of their purpose? And this is a tricky conversation because this is more of the Barrett work last year from top teams. If you're familiar with Barrett, one of the things that they do is they provide a list of 110 or 120 values words from which you can choose the 10 that you would aspire to, and in this case that you would aspire to as a team. That's a team I would like to be a part of. So out of those, and out of, what's 400 times, out of 40,000 responses last year, these are the 25 that came up most consistently for teams. And those are good words, right? We'll come back to the question about your specific team. We were doing this with actually an HR leadership group who has been asked, it's a big company, it's a 150,000 person company, with a great track record of success and a need to pivot. All of their performance management, all of their leadership development to date is built on their history of success. And the thing is, they need to create a new future. And there's acknowledgement from the very top of the organization that we need to create a different kind of leader and a different kind of collaboration and leadership model within our organization. By the way, executive development team, tell us what that is. And we're counting on you. And so the offsite with the leadership development team was, how do we need to change our behaviors and you know, what's our purpose? So they defined purpose. What are the values they're going to take? And the top 3 values they picked at the first pass were accountability, open communication, and continuous learning. So all 3 of those are up there. And the pushback from the leader of that team, and oftentimes we end up giving the pushback. I mean, if you're facilitating this conversation, this is a great place for you to step in and give pushback is, okay, those are great values. They're kind of motherhood and apple pie values. Are they enough? You have an opportunity to change the future of this organization, but to do so, you actually have to change what it means to be a leader here. Are you going to do that through accountability, open communication, and continuous learning? And they ended up at a very different place. So what's interesting about this is that I'm going to put the operator hat back on for a moment and say, you'll notice, obviously, in looking at this, that these are not strictly speaking values words. There's some actions and behaviors mixed in with this. We specifically didn't get semantic with them about values. I think all of us have been around tables where somebody says, well, here's what I see as the mission of our team or our organization. Somebody else says, well, that's not really a mission statement. That's more of a vision. And everybody rolls their eyes and sinks about 2 inches lower in the chair and just wants to be somewhere else. What was important for us, and what's important especially with operators, I think, is that the team owns this. They're willing to sign their next 12 months or 24 months of their life to this. And that ownership, that level of, you know, so we talked about accountability and mutual accountability, that willingness to start to own this, not as the company's values on the wall, but as our values that we need to bring to every single team discussion, starts to change the dialogue. And then finally, and again, this can be a quick or a long conversation depending on the clarity the team already has, but you know, behaviors, clearly, we all know this, behaviors trump values statements all the time. So you have to have a pretty specific conversation about the values. Now, the easy question to ask is, all right, what are the values or the behaviors, that support the values we just put up? Because it's collaboration, it's listening to hear versus listening to talk. You know, I mean, some of those things are really simple. The better question, or I shouldn't say that, the more effective question I find when it comes to getting people's attention is, let's define the behaviors that would, right out of the gate, just basically cut our values off at the knees. And you get a very different kind of conversation with that. And just one quick example, a team that it's a global organization with all kinds of matrixed reporting lines, which I'm sure none of you have to deal with. And there's a COO to whom all the region presidents report. And the finance people within the regions report into the region presidents. Well, there's also a corporate CFO who has a dotted line to all the regional CFOs. And he would periodically call all the regional CFOs together to discuss sometimes incredibly mundane matters of policy, but bottom line is he was pulling them all together. And quite often, the COO would find out about that from one of the region presidents asking him, oh, by the way, why is Tom pulling all the regional CFOs together? What's going on there? And he wouldn't know, and it infuriated him. And in the team, as we started talking about basically going around, you know, if we go around behind each other's backs, if we surprise each other, that's not a helpful thing in achieving our purpose or in modeling behavior for our teams that we want to model. What came out was the CFO thought, I mean, he said, I get 160 emails a day. I cannot keep up. I know that you do not want to know about a shift in our benefits package. It would bore you to tears. You're welcome to join that conversation. I didn't email you about it because I thought I was doing you a favor. I didn't mean to blindside you. And you get to a conversation about how do we need to communicate as a team? Not only what are the motives between how we've been behaving, which, by the way, you don't want to spend a lot of time on past behavior. You want to keep people focused going forward. But by getting them to define the behaviors that are going to trip them up off the start, you can get to a pretty robust place. So what I'd like you to think about is the team that you talked about last time and the purpose that you talked about last time. On that team, if you were able to get somewhere on the purpose question, what are one or two behaviors that support the purpose? I know this says values, but that support the purpose that you wrote down. And what are a couple of behaviors that are currently undermining? So take a moment. And again, if you could write that down. And then I'd like you to talk around your table and let's see if there are any themes. We'll take about 3 minutes for this. Okay. As you've been having this conversation about behaviors, and particularly as you look at a couple of behaviors that tend to undermine purpose, what came up? Any themes? Yep. Okay. Undermining. Defensiveness. Okay. Is that all that we had for common themes? I can't.
Just showing up,
Just showing up? Well,
You all know you got those people.
right. Hidden agendas. Thank you. Yeah. I mean, I don't think there are things that are unique to cultures, and cultures of engineers, as an example, especially if they're highly competitive internally, you have challenges where people tend to listen in order to talk. And where yes but, which you mentioned from your family, yes but becomes, or yes and if they're really diplomatic, yes and becomes the most common phrase in any meeting, which make meetings go from 30 minutes to 90 without anything additional being accomplished in the last 60. So, we put this to this was actually a group of, this was a group of engineers, which is why I put this in here. But if you think about the violations of the value, this specific value, which was building trusting partnerships inside and outside the organization. I'm guessing some of those look mildly familiar. We won't compete internally, dominate and not participate, assign motives, place blame. So the purpose of this conversation, which frankly, what they wanted to do was get to strategy and execution. And it was, okay, absolutely, we're right, we're almost there, but let's just make sure we're clear on this first. The purpose of this was not for us to define for them, because we'd done interviews in the team. You, as people who are close to the teams you're talking about, you could write this for the team. It's not about that. It's about the team taking it and owning it themselves. What's fascinating then is the degree to which they are holding each other accountable. And people will interrupt meetings and say, hey, wait a minute, that's a yes and statement. Do you have something, do you want to disagree or do you agree? And people throw up their hands and they'll joke about it mostly, even although emotions occasionally get high. But it's they own this because they've done the mapping. So I'm specifically, I'll put that graphic up in a moment again, I'm specifically skipping strategy and execution. Partly because that's not the point of our being here today, and partly because it is the comfort zone for operators. They might need some help from you facilitating those conversations, but they don't probably need you to help them understand strategy or understand execution. The challenge is that if those are the kind of the framework, purpose, values, behaviors, and linkages end up being the ligature. I realize I called it plumbing a few slides ago. I probably shouldn't mix metaphors that much. But this notion of linkages, so I mentioned organizations being teams of teams. It's interesting to us, and again, I think that this is a pendulum issue, and the pendulum's at one end of the spectrum right now. It's interesting enough how few teams are actually clear on the linkages within their own team at the moment. If Asia misses its numbers, I don't really care because I'm hitting my numbers, so it shouldn't affect me. As opposed to, and nobody will quite say that, but that's very clear in the actual behavior and interaction. Let alone when you start thinking about the linkages outside the organization. Outside the direct team, excuse me. And so having this conversation and trying to create more of an enterprise mindset within leaders, particularly with where we are today, we find as one of the critical linkages, the notion of accountability versus responsibility. Everybody wants more responsibility. It's a different question when you ask about actually being accountable for it. So getting clear on what that means. And then the notion of this not being a purely, on the one hand, the performance of the team, we sink or swim together, but the reality is there is no such thing as a team in isolation. So getting quite specific as you map through with a team, what do we owe to each other? Who in the organization are we dependent upon for success? What's our communication and relationship to them? And how do we think about that inside the company? And are there stakeholders outside? I say this because it is interesting to us that teams are rarely aware of how they show up. And I'll talk about a specific team here, a leadership team that is really good at execution, and they will tell you that about themselves. And they feel like because they always speak in public when they talk about strategy, they speak with really one voice. They're remarkably consistent, that everybody must perceive that any differences they have are purely private. Well, the rest of the organization all know that the C-suite is on different pages strategically, and it raises question marks for them. Similarly, again, everyone in the organization will acknowledge that as a team they execute well, but there is a real challenge there that they'll get one request from the CIO about a systems change that involves some financial pieces. They'll get a different request from the CFO that has about a 40% overlap. And then one of the region presidents will ask a question about restructuring or rescaling that has about 30% overlap with that. And the question is, we create parallel work streams out of that top team. Do they not talk to each other? And the answer, by the way, was kind of no. And finally the notion of, well, my role is clear because I know my calendar is booked from 7 in the morning until 7 at night, so my role is clear, versus the rest of the organization really understanding this question of purpose and what do you do. So all of these end up coming out of the linkages conversation as much as from the earlier pieces. And as you might expect, if you get this at least clear and mapped, now when you proceed to how are we going to execute our strategy, it starts to become, you get fewer parallel work streams, you get much less overlap, and you get much less time just lost to churn in the process. So, look, my point in all of this, in this conversation, I'm going to use a reference to Mad Men, which I haven't watched in a few years, but it's, I think there was something, sort of a recurring theme, but if you don't like the story they're telling about, you change the story. And I think that to some degree, what we see in this translation barrier that exists sometimes between HR and the operators is a question of, are you coming to me with another performance management process change? Is it going to be easier? Is it going to be worse? As opposed to, are you helping me run my business better? Which is what the HR people are there usually wanting to do, feeling like what they're bringing to the table is in fact going to do, but again, translation, it's bouncing off the door of the office at times. By HR being able to help facilitate this conversation, you can actually change the ongoing dialogue, because this tends to produce fairly immediate business impact. And it's, measuring success on this kind of a conversation is easy. It's different for every single team, but it's pretty easy and it's reasonably immediate. And I'll give you, I'll just wrap this up with 2 examples, and we can open to questions. But the team that I mentioned that was in turnaround and had, the automotive supplier had the manufacturing challenges, HR brought this to the table, and at first there was a fair amount of resistance because it seemed like it was going to be a team-building kumbaya thing. When they realized that we were in fact going to get down to brass tacks and that HR was driving it, they have in 6 months' time, the story's gotten better in the next 6 months, but in the first 6 months they were able to shore up the manufacturing problem that they had, in part because the head of manufacturing operations stopped jumping on a plane every time a conversation got heated, which was a real problem before that. But they were able to shore that up. They were able to stop bleeding cash. They lost one of their major longtime customers almost right after the meeting, but they were able to win them back and secure them for long term. And they are making money now. They haven't made money in many quarters, but they're making money now. The ability for a team to turn something around when they actually are working together as a team is surprisingly quick return. It's not, many of our investments of time and energy as developers of leaders take years. This doesn't. And the other example is the high-performing team out of pharma where everybody was hitting their numbers, but there was a question of how they could be better. And in that case, by having this conversation explicitly and by putting the question of risk, it was the question of if we're all making our numbers, how much does it matter how we stretch as a team. The conversation became not can we grow market share by 3% in China, but we're at 36% in China. I think we can get to 52% over the next few years. I don't want to sign up for that because I'm afraid if I do, my head will get cut off. The question became, how do we make those kind of stretch commitments to each other internally? Which, by the way, turned into a shift in how they judge performance management because they added a team component specifically to their performance metrics, and it changed their compensation. They decided to change comp on that. The result was they crushed their numbers for 2013. And when that organization reorganized generally at the end of 2013, many of the people from that business emerged as leaders in the new organization. People were paying attention to the changes they made. So I think the upside for HR is high on being able to bring a different kind of conversation to the table, so that when we, in addition to our focus on assessing and developing and measuring performance of individual leaders, we start to think a little more broadly, where possible, about how can we actually help them as teams and as members of teams versus just leaders of teams, as members of teams take their whole game forward. Thank you. We have a couple minutes for questions, if I don't know. Yes? I won't. Oh, yes.
So you just mentioned a comment about a company adding a team component into their performance management system.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us a little bit more around sort of what that looked like? How did they measure it? How do they hold people accountable? That kind of thing.
Yeah, I can tell you a little bit more about it. That's exactly how much I can tell you. But it's it's interesting because it was. I want to hit compensation first, because that was actually part of the lens that they were looking at it. They looked at not just the team's ability to hit its fundamental target. They measured the team's ability to surpass targets. They measured the team's impact in terms of employee engagement. So it's not just individual leaders or individual geographies. It was the team's ability. And the thing that they're working on right now, I mean, again, they've scattered a little bit in the organization, but they've all sort of started this up with their new teams. And part of the component that they're looking at right now is the question of talent movement, actually, as a metric. And it has been this conversation, which was non-existent prior to this, but it has been this conversation about how do we, if we're truly effective as a team, one partial measure of that is looking at how we develop other leaders in the organization. So the managers have a component. Now that might be taking it a bridge too far for purely team. It kind of goes beyond. But it's interesting because it came out of the team conversation that they just never had before.
So this was something that happened more at higher levels of the organization that had teams, so it was sort of how they were building and creating and engaging and
Developing their teams, or is there also a team component for the individual contributor?
So a team component for the, I'm sorry, can you ask that?
So it's, I mean, the way I just heard you describe it sounds like it's more around sort of the leaders being responsible for their team. So, being able to look at team engagement scores and things like that. But if you were an individual that didn't lead other people,
Right.
did they also do a team?
Yes, actually, there was a component of it. Your percentage would be small, and I don't know the exact percentages in the comp. But part of what they were doing was in the terms of mutual accountability. So, and this is not an exact, but the CFO didn't have a big team. This is not a top level. It's a business unit. Financial person didn't have a big team. But that doesn't exempt you from the notion of how are we doing at developing talent. You have a stake in this. So when we're talking about it, don't check your email. It's actually going to affect your comp and performance. So, does that make sense? Other questions? All right. Yes.
It's a little bit more of a general question. It relates to the scope of this, and it's a little bit outside. But given that I presume the majority of this room is HR professionals at some capacity, how have you seen, or what advice might you have to get authorized to bring these questions up to some of our senior partners? Because a lot of times we are traditionally viewed as transactional, reactional, kind of like that, and to just come on in with kind of some of these.
So, by the way, what's your
Yeah.
purpose?
Right.
Yes. There has to be, there has to be some invitation to have the conversation. Now, I would say it doesn't have to be anywhere near as explicit as what, kind of where we're driving with this. So, one of the points is, as you are starting with either performance planning or year-end comp, there's some milestone natural moments when you can say, all right, we got all that checked, we know how we're going to handle the paperwork. How can I help you and the team be better? Is that a conversation that I'd like to think about that as I look at my next year? And those are soft probes. You could get shut down hard on that question. And if so, then don't bloody your head against the door. But those are the times when, I mentioned subtle versus sneaky, but those are the times when you've got the opportunity to start probing around. Or, I've been thinking about our team, and how do we, et cetera. Okay? So, all right. Thank you. If there's no more questions, I'm going to go get a drink of water because it's really hot up here. Thanks. Great.